Hi, I'm Brian Lowery, professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and this is the interview series for Leadership for Society. And in this series, we're talking about the intersections of public and private leadership. And today, I'm talking to Charlotte Howard, executive editor and New York bureau chief of The Economist. Hey, Charlotte.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Very
Um,
well.
good. You've been at the helm of The Economist for a while now. How long has it been?
I joined The Economist in 2004, so in June it will be 21 years. And our editor-in-chief has been here for even longer than that. So relative to many people at The Economist, I'm a newbie.
The question I have for you is, given the amount of time you've been there, you've seen a lot. What are some of the most significant challenges you faced at the publication, and how have you navigated them?
Well, The Economist has been around since 1843. So there are a lot of challenges that, as a publication, we've navigated over the course of that more than 180 years. I think that if you look back to when I joined in the early 2000s, media was really trying to figure out how to sustain a business that had been largely built on ad revenue and that was transitioning to an environment in which so many people were getting their news online, right? So at the time, this felt really seismic. The Economist, I think, made the very wise decision and judgment that journalism, no matter where it's published, is worth paying for. And so we kept our prices high because we think we have something of value, even if people were only reading us online. And so we weathered that transition back then, I think, pretty well. Now you see a whole different array of factors, of course, that the media has to deal with, which I know we're going to get into. Everything from political polarization, distrust in media, uh, the advent of AI generated summaries online that aggregate information from all around the web and present it to users, people getting their news not just from TV or radio or digital publications, but also from TikTok. So it's just a very rapidly shifting media environment. And I think every publication is making a different bet on how to navigate it. I think the Economist strategy is a pretty sound one, but it's an exciting time for media because I think that there's a lot of opportunity to be seized as the need for trusted information, I think, becomes ever more important.
hmm So one of the things you just pointed out was that you believe that the information that you provide is valuable, that it's worth paying for. Um, should we think about reliable, trusted information as a product to sell?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, right? I think that there is a reality that really quality journalism requires investment. I mean, we at The Economist have reporters all over the world. We are not depending on, freelancers on a shoestring budget
hmm
to deliver reporting. We have expert correspondents within China, within South Africa, within the Middle East, within Ukraine. That type of journalism requires uh, investment, and I think journalists deserve to be able to earn a living, and that is a product that I think the public values and should pay for. That being said, there are all kinds of ways that The Economist and other organizations can experiment with making their journalism more widely accessible. So, for example, we have a product called Espresso, which is its own app, and it has concise news on really big global subjects daily. And last year, we made it free for students. Any student in any part of the world can have this for free. And they get a selection of articles, longer articles from The Economist itself as part of that. And we did that because we think espresso is a great product. We think that the news that we deliver through that platform has value, particularly for students who want something quick and, want something digestible. And also, candidly, it's a commercial play. If you introduce people to The Economist early, hopefully they might want to graduate at some point to the broader subscription as well. So I do think that journalism is worth paying for, and I think it's important to always be seeking new audiences and getting information to a broader set of people.
hmm No, I certainly believe it's worth paying for, but I wonder when it's a private product. is there pressure to give people what they want, right? So now if you think of them as customers, right? So how do you maintain your integrity when you have a sense of, oh, I know people like loud voices, right? So you see a lot of movement toward opinion and then more and more polarized opinions because there's a clear audience for that. So when you're a private industry and you're trying to manage this shifting landscape, how do you maintain that integrity as opposed to shifting to giving people what they want?
I think that's such a good point, and I think you see in real time different publications making different bets on that, right? I mean, I was really struck after the election, this most recent election. I got a lot of marketing emails from other publications that to me almost read like a self-help group letter. I don't know if you got these as well, but there was a sense that these publications wanted to like accept people who were really distressed by the election and uh, almost become a haven for those people who hold those opinions. And I think that that's a valid strategy for some publications. For us, uh, our value, the Economist value, has always been in trying to present a really clear-eyed assessment of what is actually happening, um, and what it means for what comes next. And I think if we were to abandon that, we would lose our differentiation in the marketplace. And then the second thing I would say is that in our leader pages, it's a publication based in headquartered in the UK, and our editorials are we refer to as our leaders. But our leaders do take a stand very proudly on different issues, and The Economist for a long time has stood for ideas that increasingly in 2025 are really unpopular. So, as an example, we think that the transatlantic alliance is really important and worth defending. We think that protectionism and the walling off of economies is bad, and that's a pretty lonely place to be actually in 2025. So if you want it to be popular, you would stop arguing for those things, right? But then what would The Economist be? It would just be like everybody else. So
Mm,
I think that I think if you lose a clear sense as a publication of who you are, it might maybe deliver a short-term gain, but in the medium or long term, it would be a huge mistake.
mm. It's interesting that your leaders take strong positions on issues of the day. There's in the universities right now, there's a lot of talk about institutional track neutrality. That's something that's come up at Stanford as well. And when you think about media, especially like The Economist, you'd think that this is the kind of place that would be committed to neutrality. So how do you balance that the need for some sense of objective truth and neutrality with the willingness to speak out on particular issues. How do you manage that tension?
Well, I can take a recent example. If you look at the news in the past few weeks, uh, the Trump administration has had a whirlwind of policies that it has unveiled largely through executive action. And some of the goals or the problems that those policies claim to be trying to fix, uh, The Economist would argue through its reporting, through the people who are doing reporting on these specific issues, that, there is a need for reform. Take the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is in need of reform, according to our defense correspondent, who is Shashank Joshi, one of the best journalists in the world covering defense, really, really knowledgeable. That doesn't mean that the way in which the Trump administration is pursuing those reforms makes sense, or indeed that the Trump administration is likely to be successful because of the people that Donald Trump has put in charge of this endeavor. But that kind of argument, which is grounded in real reporting and grounded in truth, when you identify a real problem, uh, we think it's worth explaining to readers what's actually going on. So there's one way to cover that news story, which is, Pete Hegseth is so horrible, which I don't think he's qualified to have his position, right? Nor do my colleagues at The Economist. But that actually ignores the substantive truth of what's happening within America's defense budget, how that intersects with America's global priorities. We view that problem as worth explaining in a clear way for our readers, uh, and uh, and then we put it on our cover, right? And we had an opinion article that explained what the opportunity is and how it could go quite wrong with Donald Trump at the helm. So that's a long-winded answer. I'm not sure I quite answered your question, but what I'm trying to get at is uh, you can have real reporting which is grounded in conversations with, people throughout the administration or depending on the news story within a given company, within a given uh, community, right? And that leads to reporting that has a clear-eyed view of something that is happening and something that matters, and that has value. It's not devoid of, it doesn't mean that you can never have a opinion on something. It just means that opinion is an informed one.
Mm. And, also thinking about having an opinion, and you mentioned your leader speaking up. One of the things about private ownership of media or people with a lot of editorial power is that they can impose their views on the organization, or there's a risk there. So recently, for example, Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, made a statement that the opinion pages would, quote, embrace personal liberties and free markets. What does that tell us about how much power we want to give to people that own media or even like the leaders in mass media? Like, I wonder how you think about that issue and connecting it to your sense of like people making claims about where we are and where we should be. Who gets to make those claims?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. At The Economist, our ownership structure is quite distinct, and it's worth explaining because I think it's part of what sets us apart from our competitors. So there is no majority shareholder of The Economist. It is privately owned, but no one controls it. And there also is absolutely no interference from the shareholders of The Economist in the coverage of The Economist newsroom. So on those two dimensions, one, that there's no majority shareholder. If Jeff Bezos owned a chunk of The Economist, he would be outnumbered by the other people who are shareholders, right? So he couldn't try to impose his rule. And then two, the governing principles of The Economist mean that the board and the owners of The Economist don't influence what we cover, how we cover it, right? This is a truly independent newsroom. And I'm very grateful for that. And that's part of why I've spent my career at The Economist, because I think it's increasingly unusual and has real value.
And I also wanted to touch on you host a podcast called Checks and Balance, which is, I don't know, at the moment seems very apropos for any number of issues. How do you think media should interact with government? What's the relationship between media and government, do you think?
Uh, I think it's kind of what it always has been. I'm curious what you view as, you know, I'm curious in your opinion of that question. But I think that media has a very clear role in illuminating what governments are doing, including through, reporting with people within the administration, people who are affected by given policies, leaders of other governments with which a particular government might interact. The media has a role in probing difficult questions and then laying them out for their audience. What
Mhm.
do you think the relationship is?
I do think that the media should have a role in holding the government accountable, and their role in holding the government accountable is providing information. However, as a private industry, it's subject to the rules and laws of the countries that it operates in, and it's possible that its fortunes might depend on the way those rules and governments operate. And I bring this up because recently, there have been settlements from some mass media organizations with Trump on his defamation lawsuit, and one could reasonably argue that those settlements look like an attempt to avoid retribution or look like they're driven by some kind of concern that is not really about the reporting that they did. And so I wonder what you make of that, right? Is that a sound business decision? And if so, is that consistent with the role that media should play?
I am not going to comment on the specific cases, as you can imagine. I think that there is no one in media who is looking at the current interaction between this administration and the media who uh, finds it to be business as usual. Okay. Where this leads us, I'm not sure. I really don't know. And I think that I neither want to be hysterical nor naive, right, about the way that the Trump administration views media. I'm one of many thousands of reporters who, in covering Trump campaigns, has had you know an entire arena turn around and jeer at me, yelling at the reporting section, right, and saying liar, like liar, 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 with real vitriol, right? So I think that there is an antagonism towards the media that is just different than ever was the case, or it hasn't been the case at least for a very long time. And the jeers of liar at a Trump rally are by far the most harmless, right, of the potential actions that could follow. And so I don't know where this will take us, Brian. Honestly, I don't know. But for now, I think the only response from a media organization such as ours is to just keep doing what we've always been doing. There's been absolutely no adjustment to our coverage, the way we think about covering the administration. It's very consistent, and I don't see that changing.
Mhm. And I don't know how big a student of media history you are, but I'll ask anyway. I mean, is it really unprecedented? Like I could imagine, and during Vietnam, there would have been a lot of tension between the media and the government, right? So when there are contentious issues, big contentious issues in the country, or huge polarization, you'd have to think that there'd be significant tension between the media and the government. Like I wonder, is this is this novel, the situation we're in right now, do you think?
I'm not as I have to confess, I'm not a scholar of media studies. I find I've covered a lot of things in my career, but I've never been a media reporter explicitly. I, uh, I think it depends. Certainly, there are countries around the world, right, where the media has been uh, silenced gradually, and I think that one thing that's a positive about the current environment, which is extremely competitive in media, is that it's actually just not possible to silence press in a way that it might have been. There are just too many outlets, right? It's a game of whack-a-mole. So I think that reporters don't become reporters because they want to become really rich, right? So people do this because they think it matters, and the outlet in which they deliver their reporting should evolve if there was some nightmare scenario, right, where it just became um, a truly repressive environment. I don't at all think we're there yet, so it's very premature. But yeah, I mean, we'll see. We'll see.
Hmm. I guess my concern is you don't need a truly repressive environment if organizations are concerned about their private interest, if you can shift the incentives such that their incentives align with what you want them to do. That would be my primary concern.
I really don't see that happening at major news organizations in the United States.
Okay, that's great. So I wonder as you look forward, what are your biggest concerns about the landscape, the media landscape as you look forward?
Uh, well, I think you've just listed a big one, right? And I'm trying to convey my honest opinion, which is that I just don't know actually, right, where that will head. So that's one. I do think that AI poses both a challenge and an opportunity for news organizations. So clearly a challenge if people turn to chatbots consistently to get their information rather than to trusted news sources. I think that the opportunity really for places such as The Economist is that one, we can use AI to create new products that readers and listeners might find useful, whether that's translating our journalism into many different languages, so we reach a broader global audience. To your point earlier, how do you get information out, good information out to a broader set of people? Another is by, you know, making some processes more efficient. But really, I think, and I hope that the arrival of AI generated information actually raises the value of trusted alternatives. And AI generated chunks of knowledge will always be reductive and it will never be original, right? Just by the nature of how that information is generated versus having real reporters who are in the room where it happens and are on the ground and having that reporting be fact checked, which we do, and having it paired with expert analysis by people who've been covering given countries or issues for a long time. I do think that that actually becomes ever more distinctive in this environment. So I'm cautiously optimistic for uh, publications such as ours, which I do think have something differentiated and are committed to it. I think it's not a time to be kind of wishy-washy and dumb down what you're doing. It's a time to try to remain committed to the purpose of a given newsroom.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. One of the things that I worry about is kind of the fracturing of truth, right? There's so many places you can get information and there's not a agreed upon truth that we can all work from. And it's tough for a society to exist when there's not some basis of agreement that we can depart from, that we can make, adjustments from. When everyone has their own truth, it's really tough to work together.
Absolutely. No, I agree. That's a a huge issue. I mean, I used to be when I was a younger reporter, I covered the middle of the country. So I was based in Chicago and I covered North Dakota to Ohio. And that was from 2007 to 11. So I was covering the 2008 presidential campaign. I was covering the impact of the Great Recession on Rust Belt states. Did a bunch of stories on a town in Ohio that had the biggest mass layoff of the recession. I was covering the fracking boom in North Dakota. I was just always all over the place in the middle of the country. And during my drives, which could be 6, 7 hours long, I would toggle between NPR and Rush Limbaugh. Okay. And what they were talking about on NPR was just a completely different thing than they were talking about on Rush Limbaugh. They weren't talking about the same issue through a different lens. It was an entirely different news cycle. Okay. And so now you have that phenomenon, but times, a trillion, right? It's just been an exponential shift even since then, which was 15, 16 years ago. And this came up, it was interesting in the coverage of California wildfires, where even people who were really, very, I would say, you would think of as an elite,
Mhm.
were getting information that was different than a different member of the elite. These are people who pride themselves on their grasp of complex issues, right? And the reason why is because they were just getting their information from entirely separate sources that were giving entirely separate information. So I do think that you're right that fracturing of basic facts is really problematic. I mean, I think there's no two ways about that.
hmm So I have one more question for you. What advice would you give to I'm sorry, what advice would you give to aspiring journalists and leaders who are just starting their careers in media?
Um, I would say that this is a career where you're doing something that matters. I do really believe that. I think that to the extent that you can report on, uncover something big that is happening with real time and explain it to an audience so that they can then, go on and do, whether it's in their personal life, their civic life, their professional life, that they can be uh, armed with real information and then act. I think that that's a real service to an audience, to society. And the second thing I would say is that being a reporter is so fun. It is just so fun to be able to go around and ask people questions about something that is fascinating and something that is changing and something that's complicated, and then go back and piece that information together in an article, in a podcast, in a video, however you want to present that information to your audience, and do so in an engaging way. Like that, for me, there is literally nothing more fun than that. Don't tell my boss, but I would do that. I would pay to let someone have me do that. Okay. So when I look back over my career and I think about, being on a oil ship in the middle of the ocean and reporting from within the Middle East in Saudi, or being in China trying to understand how that country is changing. I did a long essay on Alaska and what Alaska tells us about climate risk. It is just the most fun job in the world. Honestly, I think if you're so inclined, probably being a professional basketball player would be awesome too. But my skill set is not there.
And I'm curious. Well, I do have one more question. How do you evaluate success? How do you evaluate success for yourself as a reporter?
Uh, that's really interesting. I think that when you're able to illuminate something, either something that everyone is paying attention to, like the biggest news story in the world, the election of 2024, or something that people should be paying attention to but aren't. So again, just because this comes to mind, just because I mentioned it, when I was writing about this town in Ohio that had a huge mass layoff it must have been in 2010 or something like that. It was really in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Um, and explaining what the impacts of the financial crisis were on that particular place, and helping readers from, London to New York to Beijing or wherever they were understand the fallout. Uh, you know, I think that those stories are really satisfying, when you can. In some ways, they're even more satisfying, honestly, than writing about the big election or the big IPO or whatever it is. When you can kind of shed light on something that might otherwise be ignored but actually matters. I think that's really satisfying as a journalist.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, Charlotte. And I hope for you and for us that you shed more light on a array of issues because we certainly need more light these days.
Great. Thanks for speaking with me.